Hello. So, this will probably be a bit of a shorter video, I think. We'll see if that ends up being true, because I think I have a bit less to talk about here, even though I have a lot to say about the stuff I have to talk about, especially Azure. We'll get to her later. Um, but first, a couple of things I realized I forgot to talk about in the previous video. Um, so first of all, it's been confirmed that I was right. Vale does in fact like Kaladin, um, while Shallan prefers Adolin. Or rather, Radiant prefers Adolin, and I guess Shallan herself is torn. So it's interesting that she's split herself along the lines of her own romantic uh, conflict. Um, we'll see if that gets handled well. Like I've said before that I really don't like love triangles. I feel like this one has the potential to be interesting if Sanderson really, really leans into the fact that Vale and Shallan are separate people, uh, thereby not really making it a love triangle, because they actually could be in relationships with completely separate people at the same time without it being as much of an issue. We'll see how, like I said, we'll see how Sanderson handles this particular story going forward. It has potential in the hands of an author who is less conservative about relationships than I feel like Sanderson probably is. Um, maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. He's proven me wrong before about other stuff. So yeah, that was the thing that I wanted to talk about that I forgot to talk about in the last video. The other thing I wanted to talk about in the last video is how much Shallan's story and character have changed over the course of these books. I realize this because I have a friend who is currently just started reading the Stormlight Archive. He just finished The Way of Kings. He's starting Words of Radiance now. And while he was reading Way of Kings, we talked occasionally about the story uh, up to the point where he was at. Um, and the thing that I realized while doing that is that I found it much easier to talk in a spoiler-free way about Kaladin and Dalinar in while he was reading book 1 than about Shallan. And the reason for that is that Kaladin and Dalinar, while they do change and grow as characters, and their positions change over time, the basic premise of their characters is still the same. Kaladin is the honorable general trying to do the right thing in a world that is filled with injustice and dishonor, and that's what he was at the start of book 1, and that's what he still is now. Did I say Kaladin? I meant Dalinar. And Kaladin is the soldier who who feels like the whole world is against him and who is struggling against the injustices of the system he was born into, uh, and who is also really dedicated to protecting his friends and those around him. That's who he was at the start of Way of Kings, and that's who he still is now. Shallan, however, at the start of the Way of Kings, Shallan was an apprentice scholar trying to steal a soulcaster, and she was torn between loyalty to her family and her own interest in scholarship. And now Shallan is a Knight Radiant with a split personality, torn between her desire to be a professional spy and her loyalty to those who are close to her and to her own ideals. Um, and she's gone through so many phases in the meantime. She's still working with the Ghost Bloods. Um, she's obviously got the whole Veil thing going on. She's got the whole Kaladin Adolin thing going on. It's just a lot. Like, a lot has been added to the basic premise of Shallan's character in the meantime, and I just wanted to point that out. Like, I don't necessarily think that a character uh, who changes and grows a lot is inherently better than a character who stays relatively the same over time. But in this case, I do think it's a major strength of Shallan as a character that that she is an extremely dynamic character, and it's basically impossible to predict uh, where she'll be a book from now, because there's so much that could happen with her, because she has so much going on. Um, and a part of that is the fact that obviously at this point she's basically two separate characters. Um, anyway, on to the actual stuff I want to talk about in this video. I'm gonna start with a minor thing that's sort of been woven through the books since the end of the second book. It's been a theme, and I believe I mentioned it briefly there, but I want to talk about it a bit more. So, I'm not sure how to feel about the way that disability, and by that I mean specifically physical disability, is handled in Stormlight Archive, because so far, with the exception of Gaz, I'm pretty sure every character who had a physical disability has now healed it with Stormlight. And they've never been uh, been torn about this. They've never been conflicted about this. It's been treated as like the obvious immediate thing you do once you become a surge binder. Uh, I'm talking specifically about Lopen and Hauber here. And I I don't really have a ton of experience. I haven't read a ton of stuff in disability studies. It's not really a topic I've explored in depth. But from what I've seen online, there tends to be a split among disability activists when it comes to the idea of cures. Um, People tend to feel very differently about it. And because it's not really a settled issue, even among disability activists, I'm not going to say that this is good or bad, the fact that they got healed. Personally, I imagine I would want to if I were in their shoes, but I don't know. I think a thing that I find more frustrating about this is that Lopen was healed. So Hauber being healed to me makes sense, because Hauber's loss of mobility was recent, traumatic, and he was clearly deeply affected by it. He clearly, at the time when he got the ability to draw in Stormlight, he still thought of himself as someone who should have full use of his legs, and he was very depressed and upset that he didn't. Lopen, on the other hand, Lopen had very much. First of all, he hasn't had his arm for much longer, and secondly, it feels like he had completely absorbed the fact that he had one arm into his like core identity. Like, he was the one-eyed Herdasian. Like, that's how he thought of himself. And I think it might have been interesting if the Stormlight healing didn't work for his arm, because he no longer thought of that as an injury. He no longer thought of his lack of an arm as something that needed fixing, because it was just part of who he fundamentally was. That didn't happen. He did immediately get his arm back. And I feel like there was a missed opportunity there. Now, the reason I talk about sort of self-perception and what you feel like you are is because it's been established that, at least as far as the Nahel bond goes, the rules for surge binding are very much based on your own perception. So your oath means whatever you personally think it means. There is no objective meaning to the Radiant Oaths, for example. And I feel like with healing it could work the same way. And Dalinar actually mentioned at one point that that Renarin can heal people, but only if the injury is relatively recent. Because if the injury is like has like been there for a while, then the person will have like internalized it, and it won't be perceived as an injury in a way anymore. It'll just be a permanent part of who they are. Um, which feels like something that definitely should have also applied to Lopen. And the reason I had this thought is because I believe it applies to Kaladin's brands. So Kaladin cannot heal his brands, which is interesting. And more importantly, he also cannot hide them with illusions. Shallan tries, and the illusion just disappears. I think that on some level, subconsciously, Kaladin takes a great deal of pride in his brands. And he doesn't want to get rid of them. He doesn't want to remove them. He feels like they are a pretty important part of his identity and his self-perception. They're kind of like a mark of honor for him. And that's why they won't go away with Stormlight healing. I could be wrong. There could be something deeper going on with those brands, but as of right now, that's my theory. And I just feel like it would have been kind of cool if the same thing had applied to Lopen, and if he'd become like a full Surge Binder, but just with one arm. I feel like that would have been more interesting than him just healing his arm. Yeah, okay, that's all I have to say about that particular topic. Let's talk about a few, I'm going to talk about a few minor random things before I get to Azure. I'm leaving Azure for the end, and you'll see why. Uh, actually, before that, let's talk about Venli. So, Venli, I was apparently wrong. I misinterpreted something in the previous Venli chapter, which I talked about in one of the previous videos. My reading of the scene where Venli goes into the storm to become one of the fused and then is saved from that fate by a mysterious voice, my interpretation of that was that the mysterious voice was the little spren that she has with her now, and that moment was her essentially forming a Nahel bond with that spren. That was apparently completely wrong. The voice was Odium himself. Odium himself chose her to be his herald with a lowercase h, not herald in the sense that heralds exist in this world. And he's the one who didn't let her become a fused because he wanted her for other reasons. However, I do still think that what I said happened is pretty inevitably going to happen. It's clear where the story is going with her and the little spren. I forget what she calls it. She gave it a name, but I forget what it was. So I was wrong about what happened. I misinterpreted that scene, but I still think it's where the story is going. I really like the internal conflict in Venli in these chapters where she essentially goes, I cannot be the one to stand up to Odium. I'm like the most ethically compromised person in the world. I'm the one personally responsible for bringing this whole thing back. You can't possibly expect me to now turn against it. Like it's not gonna happen. I think it will, but it's a fun. She's kind of racked with like this weird combination of pride and guilt for what she's done. Like on the one hand, she's like, I brought back Odium. I am going to be the greatest champion of Odium. And then on the other hand, she's like, oh God, what have I done? This is horrible. I've created a nightmare. Yeah. So so I'm really looking forward to learning more about Venli in the next book, which I'm pretty sure focuses on, like, she's the focus character of that one, I think. And that's gonna be really interesting. Anyway, let's talk about A couple of minor things that happened here that are just kind of minor reveals that I find interesting. A, there's a sleepless in Kolinar. Kaladin finished his drink, wishing it were one of Rock's concoctions instead, and flicked away an odd cremling that he spotted clinging to the side of the bench. It had a multitude of legs and a bulbous body, with a strange tan pattern on its back. That's part of a sleepless. I mean, I don't know for sure, but it feels weird for the book to, like, draw so much attention to it and focus on how it's a weird Kremling with a weird tan pattern. Like, that's clearly a sleepless, right? It's gotta be. I don't know why they're there. I mean, they seem to kind of just be everywhere, apparently. So, I still don't know enough about them to make any assumptions about that, so I'll just point out that that's what I think happened there. Next, there were apparently 3 unmade in Kolinar. There was Sja-anat, who corrupts other Spren, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's the Heart of the Revel, whose name I forget. And then there is Yelignar, who is the unmade who has made some kind of pact or something or fusion with the Queen. I don't know much about Yelignar. We haven't gotten a lot of details about that particular unmade. I don't even know their gender. But Sja-anat definitely looks like she might be interesting, because she appears to be an unmade who isn't quite on board with Odium's whole deal anymore. And that could be interesting. This is something I always had an issue with when reading The Wheel of Time, which is that all of the Forsaken remained ultimately loyal to the dark side. There was never really even an attempt to reform them. And I feel like this might be a hint that this story is going to maybe explore that a bit with the Unmade. What else do I have to say here? Oh, right, Sja-anat. So Sja-anat, the little excerpt, the page, which is very nicely drawn, by the way, from the Mythica, which we get about Sja-anat, says that she specifically corrupts Spren of honor and cultivation. So this resolves an issue I had earlier, which was that I wasn't entirely sure if all Spren come from honor, or if there are also cultivation Spren. I guess this confirms it that there are. So if she corrupts Spren that come from honor and cultivation, that leaves the question of why are there only some Spren in Kolinar that get corrupted by her and others don't? For example, Hunger Spren don't. My first thought is that those might be Odium Spren, but they don't seem like Odium Spren. Like, why would Hunger be an Odium Spren? And then other kinds of Spren aren't? Like why? Like, surely something like fear or anger or pain would make a better Odium Spren than hunger. I don't know what's going on there. I'm just not sure why certain kinds of Spren seem immune to Sja-anat's corruption. What else happened here? Oh, right, we get the reveal that the God King of Tukar, I want to say, is actually the Herald Ishar. That's bad. That's really bad. Seems we've got more than one completely insane Herald out there. Hopefully he's as easy to snap out of it as Nail ultimately was, but we'll see where that goes. Also, says a lot about Nail that apparently that's the guy that he trusted above everything else, the guy claiming to be God over there and just waging a war. Okay, sure. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that's like a little detail that I want to talk about here before I get to Azure, and I don't think there is. Actually, no, there is one other thing, which is the what is the name of Dalinar's Order of Knights Radiant? Bond something. I forget. Bondsmiths. Bondsmiths. So there can only be 3 bondsmiths. That means that there are 3 unique spren. One of them is the Stormfather. Logically, I would assume that that means that the other 2 are associated with cultivation and odium, respectively. Uh, the cultivation one is obvious. That's going to be the Night Watcher. I've come to the conclusion that the Night Watcher probably isn't cultivation herself, and is instead sort of cultivation's avatar, I guess, kind of like the Stormfather is for honor. Um, and that leaves the question of who the third one is. It might. I don't think we've encountered the third one yet. It might be the big wet boy over in Erie that Axes encountered. That thing seemed pretty important and big. But I can't guess who the third one might be. But I'm going to firmly place my bet on one of the remaining 2 bondsmiths being bound to the Night Watcher. Okay, and I just want to, and now before I move on to Azure, I want to talk about this quote. There is maybe one of my favorites quotes ever in this section comes from Hoyd. I am the bones of a foreign species left dying on the plain that was once, long ago, a sea. A curiosity, perhaps a reminder, that all has not always been as it is now. Holy crap, that's such a good sentence. I love that quote so much. That is so cool. I got shivers reading that. Okay, Azure. So, I am going to be talking about Warbreaker now. And I'm going to be talking about Warbreaker. I don't think I'll spoil like any major events from the actual plot of Warbreaker, but I am going to sort of spoil some stuff and like minor stuff, and also some characters are going to come up who I'm going to essentially confirm are alive at the end of Warbreaker, which if you consider that a spoiler that some of the characters are going to survive the story of Warbreaker, then and you haven't read Warbreaker, then I guess don't watch. I just wanted to leave this for the end because of that. But I don't think anything major will be spoiled here about Warbreaker. So, Azure is from Nalthis. Okay, so several things happened here to confirm that. So, first of all, the explicit confirmation, at least in my eyes, comes from the fact that whatever the hell her sword is, because it's not Nightblood, but it is some kind of special sword that has that isn't the regular shard blade. Her sword drains color from people. Like when she kills people with her sword, they turn black and white. And while I don't know of any swords in Warbreaker from what I can remember that do that, that is very clearly an effect of the kind of investiture that you get on Nulthis. Secondly, she fights with her cloak wrapped around her arm. This is a thing that people on Nulthis do. This is how Vasher and eventually Vivenna learned to fight in Warbreaker, by infusing a piece of cloth with breath and having that piece of cloth act as a shield slash armor slash tool slash weapon in combat. It's a really specific visual that's only been brought up in Warbreaker. Now, these two things alone probably would not have made me convinced that she's from Nulthis, because that's like a bold claim that she's from Nulthis. But we already know that there's been some cross-contamination between Nulthis and Roshar because Nightblood is here. And B, I noticed while reading Azure's dialogue, I noticed that she uses some weird phrases. And in particular, one of those weird phrases reminded me of a phrase that was used by Zahel in the last book. Because Zahel has like weird phrases he uses sometimes, and then when Kaladin is like, what the hell is that phrase? Zahel is like, god damn it, no one here has normal words. And I knew from very early on that Zahel is some kind of world hopper. That's not very subtle. It's clear there's something going on there. But now I'm fairly convinced that he is also from Nulthis. And the reason why is that I went back and looked at the phrases he uses. And then I looked at the phrases that Azure uses here, and I realized that most, if not all, of the weird phrases they use are about colors specifically. And that's a pretty strong hint. So I'm 100% convinced that they're from Nulthis now. Who they are, I'm not sure. There's a couple of options. Option number one is that they're not anyone we know. They're not actually characters from Warbreaker. They're just some world hoppers from Nulthis. This is fairly likely. I mean, I don't think it would be unlikely for this to be the case. But there's also option two, which is that they are Vasher and Vivenna. Those seem like the characters that they are likeliest to be if they are anyone from Warbreaker in a post-Warbreaker world, I mean. And option number three is that they are not Vasher and Vivenna, they are someone else, but... Or maybe that Zahel is Vasher, but Azure isn't Vivenna, because I feel like there's more in my head similarities between Zahel and Vasher than there are between Azure and any particular character. Anyway, option 3 would be that I'm wrong about the timelines here. There is no indication so far that Nightblood came to Roshar after Warbreaker. It is entirely possible that the Stormlight Archive takes place before Warbreaker, and that this is the backstory of Nightblood rather than the continuation of the story of Nightblood. I don't think this is very likely, but it's a possibility. And if this is the case, then these two Nulthian travelers could be someone from the past. Maybe Zahel is Vasher, but Azure is actually the woman with a sh name, whose name I can't remember, who created Nightblood, and whom Vasher killed in his backstory. Shashara, I think? Yeah, that's also a possibility. It's possible that Azure is the member of Dent's crew who has a zombie boyfriend, whose name I also forget. Again, that's possible if this is the past of Warbreaker. But I feel like that's less likely. For right now, I'm going to go with the assumption, just because it would be the most dramatic plot twist and the most dramatic reveal, that Zahel is Vasher and Azure is Vivenna. If this turns out to be true, I'm going to have very mixed feelings about the fact that I figured it out ahead of time, because on the one hand, I'm going to feel very smug about figuring it out ahead of time. On the other hand, I'm going to be kind of upset that I don't get to have the moment of, holy crap, that's who this is, when the book intends me to have it at some point later on. Of course, I could also still have that moment because I'm wrong. And also, I did have that moment, just I had it now. Like, while reading this section, I had this moment of, oh my god, what if this is what's happening? Um, so yeah, that's the main thing I wanted to talk about in regards to Azure. The fact that I'm like I'm 100% certain she's from Nolthis, and I'm like 60% certain that she's Vivenna. Let's go with that. I think 60% is about right. Yeah. Okay. Um, and before I end, I just want to talk a little bit about one more thing, which is that I was clearly right in the last section that we are building towards a situation where, in the human listener conflict, we aren't really supposed to view it as a battle between good and evil. That's why we see Cal break down at the end here, and I'm curious to see how that's going to be resolved going forward. Like, if we are supposed to view both sides as having a moral right to do what they're doing, which I do believe it has been well established. Like, when I say we're supposed to view it, I'm not saying, oh, I think Sanderson is like trying to force us to think this way when it's not actually this way. Like, no, I think in this situation, it is kind of a messy situation where there aren't bad guys in this conflict. I am curious how that's going to be resolved, and if the human listener conflict is going to continue to be the main plot of the Stormlight Archive, or if the story is going to take some kind of weird turn. Because there are like 7 books more after this, and I feel like the human listener conflict is already coming to something of a head. And it would be weird if it continued for 7 more books. So I wouldn't be surprised if the human listener conflict gets resolved in, let's say, book 5, and that ends up being, and like some new thing happens then, and then the second half of the Stormlight Archive, which is going to come after a long hiatus, from what I understand, and then that second half is about whatever the new plot is that's established in book 5. Um, this is complete speculation now, though, so I should stop. So that's those are my thoughts on the sort of plot and thematic elements of this particular portion of the book. Not a lot of super political stuff to talk about here, other than the disability politics I talked about a bit at the beginning. We're there usually isn't a ton to talk about politically in the sort of action-packed climax moments of these books. And while this is just halfway through the book, it still did feel like a very action-packed climax moment. So, yeah. See you next week for part 4. I still don't know if I'll be splitting it into 2 videos or what. I'm looking forward to seeing if my Vivenna theory gets confirmed there. Okay, see you next week. Bye.